Final Fantasy is my favorite gaming franchise, and while the original Final Fantasy VII is not in my personal top 5 of the series, it is one of my favorite games from the 90s and of all time. In 2020, I was hyped, like everyone else, for Remake. However, I was incredibly disappointed with many parts of how that game came together. So much so, that I was not interested in picking up Rebirth throughout its entire pre-release hype train. I picked up Rebirth only because of this channel, and I took my time with it to really dive deep into the game's systems and story. In 2020, I unsubbed to Maximilian Dude and Gerard the Completionist because of the way I felt their impression of the game led me as a customer astray. And while I would later resub to Maximilian Dude because he's genuinely a cool guy, I don't really trust his tastes on anything that isn't a fighting or Capcom game. With Rebirth, the acceptance of muted mediocrity returned to the gaming sphere, and during the review and discussion cycle for this game, I've only heard positive things, and I think this is a disservice at the hands of games media. Final Fantasy VII Rebirth has flaws, some of them serious, and these issues make this game less than the 9 or 10 out of 10 most outlets call it. Rebirth is overrated, not because it is bad, but because it is not as great as games media personalities make it seem. And in this Rayl deal review, I'll explain why this game is overrated by analyzing its open world design, dungeon design, serious story issues, and completion criteria. I will, however, stress that me saying Rebirth is overrated does not mean I hate everything about it, and I do not think it is a bad game. Bad and overrated are not the same word, although they may be used colloquially as synonyms. And starting out, I'm going to talk about the parts of the game I do think are extremely good, which are its gameplay, Queen's Blood, the times it sticks to the script, and boss design. This review is for fans of the original who were disappointed with Remake and want to know if this game turns the FF7 ship around, or others who want to hear an alternate opinion to that of the common discourse. This means I will be spoiling several aspects of the game's story, and if you don't want spoilers, this is your time to add this video to your watch list, click off the video, and return when you finish the game for yourself. With that, you are watching Rayl Deal Games, and let's dive right in. Rebirth's gameplay is undeniably fantastic. Each of the 9 playable characters are incredibly fun to play, and in this section I'm going to dive into each of the characters and what I love about the genius of the gameplay's design. Starting out, Zack Fair is the first character the player is introduced to, and he's not a character that the player will play very often, only showing up at the beginning, the end, and in the Chadley simulations. And even though he's only present in a few situations, I applaud the designers for making him distinct from his peers. Character action games live and die on their ability to make character combos fun to find and do, and Zack's design is pretty well done, with the way he builds into better versions of his moves by increasing the length of his combos. Because I didn't complete all the challenges in this game, I'm not able to comment on his high-level strategies, but for his place within the main story, he's fun to play, and for a side character, that's pretty cool. Almost immediately after Zack, the player gets access to Sephiroth, who is designed in a unique way too. And if there's one thing I love about Rebirth, it's the unique combat design for each and every character. The way Sephiroth's heavy attack changes as he combos reminds me of the way Tifa works. However, Sephiroth has an added element of countering and riposting that I particularly love. Parry builds are my favorite things to play in Souls games, for example, and I do love seeing how Rebirth starts to open up that type of gameplay a little more. Now, these side characters aren't in the party for extremely long, but their design did stand out for my entire time with the game, which is a credit to the designer's vision of how to represent the characters through their gameplay, and their ability to express the characters through fairly simple changes to their core combo framework is impressive. Returning from Remake, Cloud, Tifa, Barret, and Aerith don't change much from their original iteration, but the way they interact with one another and the new enemy types present in Rebirth changes some of their viability. Aerith is clearly the strongest character because of how her wards allow her to break the core rules of the game, especially with how Arcane Ward doubles the casts of spells. Arcane Ward, in conjunction with a spell or two, can essentially function as an instant win button for nearly every enemy encounter Aerith is in. By the time I finished Rebirth, Aerith became my clear favorite to use in essentially every team composition I came up with. I wasn't a super huge fan of playing Cloud and Tifa in Remake, and when I would play that game, I always switched to Aerith and Barret as much as possible so that I wouldn't have to play them. I don't actually think these characters are poorly designed though, I just didn't have as much fun playing them as Barret and Aerith. I'm a sucker for big guns and heavy hitting attacks, and this is something I always get while playing Barret. Even though he doesn't do a lot of raw damage, his attacks are explosive enough to give the impression of high damage, which I always enjoy. In Rebirth, I did like Cloud more, and I did spend the vast majority of my time in this game playing him. I can only chalk up my change of interest in Cloud to the differing enemy types in Rebirth over Remake, but since I didn't replay Remake before this review, I can't actually explain why that is. Tifa is still my least favorite character to play because I always find myself getting tunnel visioned while playing her. Whenever I switch over to her, I just want to rack up high hit combos and hit for massive damage, which doesn't work all the time with the way enemies rarely receive any amount of stun on hit. This leads to me getting smacked around all the time while playing her, making me not vibe with her as much. Right off the bat of Rebirth, I did get access to my second favorite character to play in this game and my favorite character from the original game, Red 13, my boy Nanaki. Red 13's gameplay is centered around his vengeance meter and building it by blocking and parrying attacks, making this character an early favorite of mine. Nanaki gave me game-given permission to abuse the parry mechanics of the game. While fighting Odin, for instance, I loved parrying all of his attacks and spamming all of Red's abilities that dump his vengeance bar for a powerful effect. Because of his mechanics, Nanaki became one of my primary healers and damage dealers throughout the game. In addition to Nanaki, Yuffie's damage output is impressive too. I don't look up guides while playing games, so in my playthrough of this game, I didn't even know about the Broken Brumal form build. I used Yuffie's doppelganger ability in conjunction with her ninjutsu to quickly stagger enemies and finish them off with a tier 3 banishment. This is a pretty simplistic way of playing the character, but it is also a pretty fun way to play her as well. And finally, Cait Sith rounds out the total roster of 9 playable characters. I honestly don't know if Cait Sith is super good or not, but I did enjoy playing with Reeve's robots. Sith is so incredibly different from other characters on the cast, but I love that about him. I especially love dropping his big dumb Moogle butt on fools and building into better versions of his triangle attack. There also seems to be a nice variety of ways to build this character, as Sith seems good either as a Moogle riding monster or as a small guy with the ability to summon a distraction consistently. All of these characters' movesets are then further improved with the inclusion of synergy actions. These provide reasons for paying attention to team compositions, since different combinations of characters provide the player with differing synergy actions. Unlocking and using each of these attacks is a lot of good, honest gaming fun, and I am looking forward to seeing this mechanic with Vincent and Cid thrown into the mix. A lot of games with good gameplay and movesets still don't stick the landing as a result of lackluster encounter design. Rebirth does not fail in this way though, because it has some stellar monsters to fight, especially with the way this game's bosses are designed. I'm a huge From Software fan, and one of the major reasons why is because I love good bosses. And no one in the modern day makes bosses the way From Software does. I love games like Mega Man X for the same reason, and it is because of my gaming tastes that I always view bosses as a reward, and when reaching the end of a long dungeon, I expect an awesome boss fight waiting for me. I can't think of one time where Rebirth let me down in terms of its boss design. I might not like some of the bosses for their lore or story implications, but that's something we'll dive into more specifically in later sections of this review. I especially love the bosses that cap off dungeons that require a specific combination of characters because they feel specifically designed around the toolkits available to the player. Midgard Swarmer, the Crimson Mark II, Galleon Beast, the Demon Wall, Genova Emergent, and Genova Lifeklinger stand out as my favorite boss fights from this game, with the 6 summons also being particularly fantastic. These 12 bosses are just a sliver of what the boss design of this game adds to the total package, and in this section I'll look at these bosses and share what I like about them and what that shows about the quality of this game's design. Part of what makes the bosses in Rebirth cool is the way they shift and remixed classic bosses and monsters of the original game. Some bosses are hard random encounters, and others are bosses that cap off each of the dungeons in the original game. Midgard Swarmer is possibly the most iconic optional encounter from the original Final Fantasy VII present in Rebirth. In the original, Midgard Swarmer is a foreboding shadow beneath the bog, bordering the cave leading to the critical path to Junon. It is placed there as a barrier preventing the player from progressing and forcing them to learn the chocobo catching mechanic so that they can make it through the swamp safely. Rebirth is a far more marionetted experience, meaning that the player has less agency to learn the best approach to progression. The original FF7 came out before games were designed to point players in a straight line towards the credits, which made these iconic moments where the player was presented with a puzzle they would need to solve through exploration or taking a second to think. Rebirth is not designed with the concept of player freedom in mind, meaning Midgard Swarmer is a more authored experience. After the party is ferreted towards the chocobos and through the swamp, Midgard Swarmer is a required encounter this time around, leading to an awesome boss fight with this serpent and providing the first major organic tutorial of the game. Whereas Midgard Swarmer taught the player to slow down and explore in the original, this snaky boy teaches the player to experiment with their team compositions in this game. This provides the player with decent variety in how they choose to interact with this boss, and in my co-op playthrough with my friend Ryan, we decided accidentally to use Tifa, Barret, and Cloud. The Serpent's moveset is fairly simple, and he really has only 4 or 5 different attacks, making him easy to learn, and I like this bit of design. Any party comp would work here, and since this is early on in the game, this provides the player with combat expressivity. Given the time to try this boss again, I would bring in Barret, Red, and Aerith, since this would allow me to prey on the boss's ice weakness while having Red distract him while building up his vengeance meter quickly, cashing his bar in for greater boons to make the boss even easier. Once beaten, Midgard Swarmer is killed by a shade of Sephiroth, and this is possibly the worst part of Midgard Swarmer's redesign. In terms of how the gameplay works for this boss, both the original and remake versions recreate the epic and imposing feel of the encounter. Although in the original, this boss is essentially unbeatable at the beginning, which gives the player a good way of assessing their power increase when they revisit the area later. Story-wise, this change is bad too because it means that there is only one of these snakes in the swamp, whereas in the original, there were many of these things. After sneaking by the Midgard Swarmer atop the back of the chocobo, the player sees the dead and discarded body of one of them skewered on a tree by Sephiroth. This built up the legend of Sephiroth better because the player can't beat one of these serpents on their own at the time, and they only get to see the leftover remnants of Sephiroth's domination of the monster. This implication made Sephiroth cooler, and I would have preferred something like that in how this section ended in Rebirth. There are plenty of great bosses that follow up Midgard Swarmer, but I'm not here to do a play-by-play of every single section of this game. I actually don't like reviews that are essentially summaries of the entire game, so that's not what I'm going to do here. So let's skip ahead to the Crimson Mark II piloted by Scarlet. Part of why I love this boss is that I just really like mechs. Given the ultimate heroine combo of Tifa, Aerith, and Yuffie, this fight is a feminine melee. The Crimson Mark II is equipped with swappable arms, which changes it from a melee-focused mech to a ranged one. And this switching of roles plays well with the assortment of characters the player has. Tifa is a close-range beast, Aerith is a spell-slinging ranged queen, and Yuffie is right in the middle, able to switch between melee and ranged roles whenever necessary. Targeting and destroying the arms gives the player a chance to deal pretty decent damage to the mech itself, and since this boss has some flashy moves itself, it looks like an epic confrontation, which is a great way to finish off this Yuffie-centric dungeon. This boss was not in the original, and it is fights like this that show the FF7 remake team have the creativity creativity and ability to craft unique content that is genuinely great. I just wish that they harnessed that muse more often, because this is probably the best thing they added to the game that wasn't present in the original, to some degree. With the summon boss fights being the only other thing that stands out in this same way to me. I'll get around to the summons at the end of this section, and I have loads of things to say about them. The Galleon Beast is also a great expansion of the original's content in Rebirth, and it does create a question in my mind as to how Vincent's limit breaks are going to work in the third part of this proposed trilogy. This fight shows off Vincent's combat abilities in an interesting way, and it makes me hope that we'll essentially just get to play as a boss-type enemy for each of Vincent's forms. And I wouldn't be surprised if there were Final Fantasy XVI icon-esque boss fights from time to time implementing Vincent's forms to take down colossal-sized enemies. Because the player would lose control of Vincent during his limit breaks in the original, the transformations could also function similarly to the summons in this game. And this is why I like this particular boss. It has me actually interested in seeing what the next game in this sub-series will bring to the table, which is not true of many of the changes made to FF7 with this game and remake. Demon walls are a staple of the Final Fantasy franchise, and they are usually these DPS checks to make sure the player is at a proper level before moving on to whatever the walls are protecting. I love the demon wall fights, with Final Fantasy XII standing out as having a particularly fun one. Rebirth might just take the cake of having the best demon wall in the franchise though, as I do really love the pressure being pancaked between two constricting walls, and even though I did not find the boss fight to be particularly hard at all, it was pretty fun. And finally, of the critical path bosses that stand out the most, the two Genova bosses are particularly fantastic. Genova Lifeklinger right at the end brought back memories of Advent Children with the way the characters come together to fight it, and I hope the next game does this type of thing again for some of the other major climactic bosses. That could be a cool way to approach like Ruby and Emerald Weapon, for example. The way that Lifeklinger is an expansion of Emergent from the cruise ship to Costa del Sol is also great too, since it shows the way Genova's influence is getting stronger over the course of the game, just like in the original. One of the more interesting aspects of FF7 original is the cosmic horror element Genova brings to the table, and I could see something like this working in the Hojo and Bizarro Sephiroth boss fights theoretically in the next game. Each of these bosses adds a cinematic quality to sections of the game that sometimes didn't have that, but some, like the Galleon Beast and Crimson Mark II bosses, aren't in the original, and these additions are some of the good ones the team did. The developers also added 6 summon boss fights too, and these are some of my favorites. I'm not going to talk about each one in detail, but Odin and Alexander are major standouts to me that I do want to discuss a little bit here. Alexander seems to be designed by harnessing some Final Fantasy XIV energy, since this hulking embodiment of justice feels like an MMO boss in some ways. The heavily telegraphed CC type abilities are what make me feel this way, and since I've played 400 hours of 14 before, I was left with a familiar impression of how the summon bosses worked in that game upon defeating Alexander. Odin 2 is a crazy cool encounter. Essentially, Odin is set up so that he will do a Zentetsuken after hitting the player enough times in succession, and the player can reduce his chance of using his insta-kill party wiping finisher by blocking, parrying, or dodging his attacks. And this put me in a position where I needed to think my way through how I wanted to approach this fight. I ended up going into the fight with Kate Sith, Red, and Cloud, setting them up in such a way as to make them the ultimate Big Chad parry squad. Beating Odin, I attained all the summons and looked forward to the times when I would need to do the boss gauntlet of all of them in the future, something I would never get around to before losing my interest in the title, unfortunately. We're a decent way into the video so far, and I've not actually said many negative things about the game, and I still have some positive things to talk about. If you're liking the video so far, consider liking and subscribing, and if you disagree with my core thesis, leave a dislike. I enjoy discussion and debate, and discourse of that nature is impossible without dissonance. Dissonant divergence is, ironically then, one of the things I don't like about Rebirth's story. But before I get into that, I want to stay positive and talk about the parts of Rebirth's story I love. The parts where they forego divergent dissonance from the original and instead stick to the script, improving some sections but otherwise treating the superb story of the original with reverence. The parts of Rebirth's story that are fantastic are when they stick to the script, updating scenes by adding further context or newer conversations between characters that add to the value of the scene. Rather than go into each individual scene where this is true, I've chosen my favorite 7, and in this section, we'll dive into each in chronological order, and I'll explain why they are the best parts of Rebirth's story. Starting out, Cloud's retelling of when he, but not really him since he's just imagining himself in Zack's shoes, and Sephiroth go to Nibelheim, meet Tifa, and investigate the reactor in the mountains is really, really well done.
Cloud,
It reminds me of that.
you asshole!
We're actively hurting our dating chances right now.
Probably.
You're going on the Ferris wheel with Barrett.
Absolutely. I like that Aerith actually tones up for that because I don't think she says anything in the original. Oh man, that's a good change. I like that.
This whole section is where the game should have begun, as it sets up Sephiroth extremely well, and does a great job at tutorializing all of the key systems in Rebirth. Ending this section with the Materia Guardian and getting rid of the Green Dragons are interesting choices, but they do make sense given the grandiose approach Nomura and Co. have taken when remaking this classic. I always like the way the Materia Guardian is one of the only enemies that is visible on the map before the party gets to them in the original, but that type of thing isn't necessary in a modern game, nor would it have been that interesting either. Teaching the player how bosses work with this one is a great way of remixing sections of the original, especially since I don't think many fans of the original consider the Materia Guardian to be super iconic. Not to the same way I do, at least. The best example of Rebirth simultaneously sticking to the script while also shifting in ways that make it better than the original is when Cloud and friends find passage to Costa del Sol. In the original, they stow away on a Shinra vessel, but in Rebirth, they go to Costa del Sol via a cruise ship, which better fits the Hawaii-coded locale they're heading towards. Rebirth is designed in such a way to drag out each individual section of the player's journey, and this is exclusively the only time I felt the team did a great job of expanding a section of the original without it becoming bloated. Instead of just absconding to Costa del Sol in secret aboard the Shinra vessel of the original, Cloud and company get to take a luxurious cruise to the idyllic destination instead. And to expand this area, the developers added a Queen's Blood tournament. For players who don't like that minigame, I could see this section being a severe letdown, but for me, I loved it. Queen's Blood is one of my favorite additions Rebirth's team made to the original formula, and capping this section off with Genova Emergent is a great way to lead into the second continent section of the story. They even carry over the way Red pretends to be a person while aboard, which is one of those weird FF7 oddities I'm happy they preserved in this game. It would have been easy to just make him hide below or something like that, but FF7 original wasn't scared to make the player laugh with the theater of the absurd like this. And if there's something I love about Rebirth, it is how they aren't shy to lean into this element of original FF7's design philosophy. After a tedious section of Costa del Sol itself, the party proceeds to Barrett's hometown of Corel, and his homecoming is another one of those things I like about Rebirth. In the original, it's quickly obvious the people of this dying mining community hate Barrett for something he did in the past, and it is in this section that the player learns about Barrett's motivation for joining Avalanche. The way he accidentally sold his town to Shinra, which he is blamed for since he was the biggest and loudest voice in favor of Shinra building their Mako reactor there, is extremely well done here. I especially like the way we learn about his beloved wife, long past. Barrett caused the death of his only love and his best friend, Dine, and this is why he takes Dine's daughter in and raises her as his own. Barrett's meeting with Dine and the boss fight that takes place there makes me love Barrett more than I already did, and by the time I rolled credits on Rebirth, Barrett supplanted Red 13 as my favorite FF7 character. That is somewhat because of how Nomura and his team butchered Nanaki for me, but we'll get into that in a later section. I do have one critique of this Barrett backstory gray area, and that's that it was a bad change to not sell the fiction that Barrett is the one that killed everyone in the Golden Saucer. There's never a point where it seems like maybe he actually had gone rogue, because they revealed Dyne way too early. When I first played the original, I was blown away by the idea that Barrett would go on a killing spree, and it made the reveal of Dyne far more interesting and heart-wrenching. The Rebirth team really did ruin this element of Barrett's story, but since they do everything else so well, I can look past that small thing, since in the grand scheme of things, it doesn't matter that much. The Golden Saucer itself is presented in a fantastic way too, and I especially love the cutscene introducing what the Golden Saucer is and its owner Dio. Dio's redesign is absolutely wonderful. He really gives me JoJo's Bizarre Adventure vibes. The welcome committee cutscene that greets the player at the gate harnesses FF7's silly DNA perfectly, and the way Yuffie participates in this scene fits her character quite well since she is essentially the embodiment of the cringy kawaii archetype. Cait Sith too also receives an amazing redesign. This character was always my least favorite playable character in the original, right behind Sid, but because of a combination of his voice acting and nonverbal characterizations, he became one of my favorites on the cast. I even have a far more positive opinion of the character in FF7 in its original context too, with the way he's presented in this game. I also find it pretty hilarious that Cait Sith acts the way he does, because it implies Reeve purposely designed this little robot to be the meme it is at all times. I also imagine Reeve sitting at his desk at work playing Sith, as if he's in an MMO. Reeve gives off the vibe that he's the type of guy who would play a female Mikote in Final Fantasy XIV is all I'm saying. Rounding out the cast, acquiring Vincent into the party is vastly improved as well. Both Yuffie and Vincent benefit in this way since they were relegated to secret bonus party member status in the original. They really only had one small scene or side quest building up their character in that original, and Rebirth does a better job of making these characters feel like valuable members of the party. Even though he's not playable in this game, the Galleon Beast boss fight does a great job at setting up what the player has to look forward to when he is playable, and his connection to both Hojo and Shinra is provided more chances to show up in Rebirth because of the added development to his characterization. The final part of Rebirth that does a great job of sticking to the script while also adding details in a tasteful way is the date and Loveless scene upon the party's return to the Golden Saucer. On my playthrough, I got the date with Barrett, which I was extremely happy to get. This is what I was trying to do from the beginning.
This is less interesting to me than here.
His date was the hardest to get in the original, and while I'm sure it is much easier in this game, it was still funny I got his on my first attempt. Barrett's date is more of a bro hangout, and even after the initial hype of getting this date, I was far more invested in this than I think I would have been if I had gotten Tifa or Aerith. Barrett bears his soul for his bro, and since he's one, if not my favorite character in FF7, I really appreciated the way this scene builds him up a bit more.
If I was gonna win her heart, I had some growing up to do. Otherwise, she'd never give me the time of day. Funny enough, our first date was at a theme park. Nowhere near as big as this place, of course. Just a traveling fair with a handful of rides. We ended up riding these wooden chocobos round and round, laughing our asses off. Look at me, boring you with my old stories.
No, you keep talking, brother.
Be the first time.
Barrett is a complicated character with a dark backstory and a history laden with regret and suffering. Given the opportunity, I'd be Barrett's friend in real life because I bet he would be a fun person to talk philosophy and life with, which is something I value highly in my friendships. There's just nothing better than staying up until 4 in the morning talking about the deepest stuff that you can possibly imagine with your best friends. You know what I mean? I nearly picked him during the Loveless performance too, but I couldn't leave Princess Aerith hanging that way at the end. It just wouldn't fit the scene or Cloud that well there. And even though I'm the player, I wanted to go with the decision I felt Cloud would be likely to choose as well. That's the way I'll always try to play the original too, and while playing Rebirth, I was always plagued by the nagging question of how it compares to the timeless original. Remake is a 30-hour expansion of 5 hours worth of content from the original FF7. Rebirth is a 60-hour expansion of 10 hours or so of content from the original, and in many ways the changes Rebirth creates more bloat and pacing problems than are worthwhile for what they add to the core FF7 experience. The awful padding issues of Remake happen again in this game, and they happen more often. There are so many sections of this game where the player is asked to navigate these overly long dungeons that stay past the point of them being interesting or intriguing. To me, it always felt like every single dungeon lasted 30 minutes to an hour longer than they should have, and this was unnecessary. The developers tried to design the dungeons in such a way to make them more interesting, such as making the Red 13 dungeon revolve around running up walls and things like that, or making the Yuffie dungeon centered around her grappling hook. These additions aren't positive though, because they aren't fun. The worst of them being Kate Sith's box throwing dungeon mechanic. They are predicated upon the idea that pressing a button when prompted is fun, which essentially makes these QTEs without the quick timing necessity. In the original, dungeon crawling wasn't a super big part of the experience, as getting through a dungeon only took a handful of encounters for the critical path. Other than the final dungeon of the game, none of them take longer than an hour, and this keeps the story moving at a brisk pace. Something the Rebirth team needs to learn is that more content is not always good. The original FF7 takes 30 to 40 hours to roll credits on, and it is pretty ridiculous that Rebirth, which is only a third of the original story, takes double or nearly triple of that. The original FF7 is a top-tier JRPG because it excels in 4 key elements: story, characters, pacing, and combat. Rebirth focuses more on combat and character interactions, which hurts the pacing of the story and the speed at which the main plot builds into its crescendo. Every single time it feels like the story is getting somewhere good, there is a several hour-long time-waster feeling bloat that bogs down the experience, hurting the story of the game and making the experience of Rebirth less appealing to me. PSX JRPGs have historically gotten a bad rap for wasting the player's time with their random encounter rates and grindy nature. But if the original FF7, which has more story, is completable in half the time of Rebirth, which only covers a part of the original, which one actually respects the player's limited time? I like the original 1997 FF7 more than Remake, and I like it more than Rebirth too. This is the section of the video where I'm going to begin critiquing Rebirth. I'll have a few positive things to say here or there, but for the most part, I don't have a lot of good things to say about my experience with the game from here on out. My title is not clickbait, though I understand if you feel like it was at this point in the video. Well, it's time to bring on the negativity, and it's time to bring on the slew of dislikes I'm about to get from the fans of this game. In the original, when Cloud and Co. leave Midgard for the first time, they are greeted by Uematsu's fantastic main theme composition. He conveys the feeling of an incoming adventure through this piece of music, and even though the openness of older JRPGs is more of a smokescreen than a lot of people would like to admit, the illusion of adventure is sold perfectly in that moment. Rebirth starts at this moment, or that's how it should have begun at least. Instead, the game starts with Zack and afterwards, Cloud's calm flashback. Even after this, the player doesn't get immediate access to the open world, and they have to go through a short quest before they're allowed to leave the City of Calm. And by the time they are free to properly explore the world of FF7, this sense of adventure is lost. Fleeing Calm is a poor replacement to the high-octane scene of escaping Midgard. When seeing the open world of Rebirth for the first time, I was quickly let down. All it took was running forward and encountering the animation for Cloud vaulting over a ledge to be disappointed. Cloud, on foot or on Chocobo back, has trouble navigating the world of Rebirth, and this really takes me out of the experience of exploration. In the original, Square used abstraction to sell the experience of Cloud and his party exploring vast open fields, desolate deserts and rough rocky inclines. Even though Rebirth is more immediate and three-dimensional, it doesn't sell the experience of traveling vast distances, as the world of Rebirth feels much smaller than the world of the original. This might be something they fix in the third part of this remake series, but at this point in time, Rebirth's rendition of FF7's world feels smaller even though it is technically much bigger. The loss of the original's abstraction hurts the game in this way, and I would have preferred if this game had an overworld of some kind, because there's a charm in that type of classic open world that is lost with what Rebirth brings to the table. There's a lot of reasons why I feel this way, and this is not a feeling that is created by just the animation oddities in the traversal of the open world. The main thing that makes Rebirth's open world feel worse than the originals is Chadley and all the stupid things he wants us to do. Rebirth's open world feels like it would have to have launched alongside Far Cry 3 in 2012, 12 years ago, to feel well designed and a good representation of a classic fantasy world. Rebirth's world is laden with activities, but most of them are not that interesting. The towers in Rebirth are a poor version of that open world mechanic. The monster challenges would have been better if the monsters moved around the open world, because it would have made the open world feel more lived in. The proto-relic challenges are a mixed bag of quality, the summon stones are a missed opportunity, the livestream scans are filler, and the quests are boring. Let me elaborate on a few of these points. Open world towers are a far cry more interesting in contemporary games than the traditionally styled ones that Rebirth apes. Think about the ways Tears of the Kingdom, Horizon Zero Dawn, and Ghost of Tsushima handle this mechanic. At its root, a tower in an open world is there to uncover more sections of the map, and in each of the games I've mentioned, they either shift the way the tower reveals the map, or the way the tower itself functions in the open world, making the mechanic far more interesting than the simple ones in Rebirth. In Tears of the Kingdom, the towers are a cannon, shooting Link into the sky and allowing the player to guide to wherever they choose. In Horizon Zero Dawn, the towers are these lumbering robots that are more exciting to climb and better fit the world than a lot of these towers do. And in Ghost of Tsushima, the tower mechanic is replaced by Mongol camps, where the reward to clear the camp is a section of the map being uncovered. Rebirth didn't need towers at all, and the ones they did put in there just aren't a great addition to FF7's world, nor are they tonally consistent with the world either. In Final Fantasy 12, 13, 15, and 16, monsters appear in the open world or dungeon to be encountered at the player's leisure, and special monsters, usually in the form of hunts, also appear in the open world that same way. In terms of Rebirth's open world activities, the monster challenges are the best. However, they are a downgrade from the hunt-based FF challenges of the past. It would have been better if all special monsters and these challenges appeared organically in Rebirth's open world. There's a lot of decisions like this that take away the reward of exploration from the player. By making these monster challenges confined areas on the map, there's no sense of discovery when the player finds them. This is my same issue with the livestream scans and summon stones. Rounding out the open world suite, quests and proto-relic challenges make up for the rest of Rebirth's discoverable elements. Very few of the quests in Rebirth are interesting, and the only proto-relic challenges I like are the Grasslands, Junon, and Meridian Ocean ones. The Junon one stands out the most since it does a good job at remixing the RTS tower defense minigame from Fort Condor in the original, though I am disappointed that Fort Condor is not in Rebirth, and its absence is one of the things that makes Rebirth's world feel smaller than it's supposed to be. All of these open world activities don't feel like proper rewards for exploration since they are marked on the map and overly telegraphed to the player. Open worlds live and die based on the value of their exploration, and Rebirth just doesn't trigger a sense of exploration at all. Part of the reason this is because all of the cool things that should be in an open world are locked in Chadley's simulation jail. In fact, everything Chadley does takes the player out of the open world, making his inclusion in this game antithetical towards the open nature of it. Imagine if the summons could have been discovered in the open world and fought in a location that better befits the summon itself. Imagine if, to unlock the summon, you had to come across the materia in the open world and fight the summon before it allowed you to take the materia with you. Summons are somewhat similar to the weapons in FF7 lore, as they are massively powerful monsters created by the livestream. In fact, one of Rebirth's biggest open world faux pas is that it takes the super boss out of the open world. In the original FF7, Ruby, Emerald, Platinum, and Ultimate weapons can be discovered in the open world, making the discovery of them more special. In the Rayl region, there's this sand giant that the player can discover by driving around, and this is the only time Rebirth ever made me happy when I explored its open world. My happiness turned sour quickly when I realized that this giant wasn't a super boss or fightable enemy, and I retroactively began to dislike that he existed at all when I discovered he is just an echo of Gilgamesh. In addition to these issues, traversing the open world is not great either. Rebirth's open world is deceivingly linear. Original Final Fantasy VII's open world is like this too, but Rebirth does a worse job at hiding that fact. Because the player is constantly directed towards locations via points on the map and in the HUD compass radial, each path towards anything in the world is linear. There's no experimentation in the exploration. There's no "I wonder what's over there" feeling, since the map always makes it clear what you're going to find in any given direction. Sometimes getting to destinations is difficult, but more in an annoying way than anything else. Gongaga and Cosmo Canyon look fantastic, but traversing them is such a chore. You see, each area of Rebirth's closed worlds are designed around the abilities of different types of chocobo, and then the ways these chocobo are able to interact with the open world is overly marked for the player with buckets of yellow paint. Open worlds should be something the player can get lost in. That's the immersion of an open world, that's why they exist, yet Rebirth refuses to allow the player to lose themselves. And its greatest offense is the way it eschews the abstraction and simple approach FF7 Original took to open world design in favor of an over-designed mess of map markers and weak activities. In terms of its quest design, Rebirth's biggest issue in this regard is just how boring and poorly written they are at times. The original FF7 had limited quests that took time to figure out. The player really had to experience the game's world before they would ever be able to complete any of the quests, and that's what made them so good. Final Fantasy XVI has better quests than Rebirth, and 16 famously has poor questing. The issue with trying to ham-fist a bunch of quests into a world that didn't need them before is the way Rebirth does so to expand the lore of FF7 and further tie the events and world of the original to the spin-offs that would later follow. This is antithetical to the spirit of the series, since Sakaguchi famously disliked sequels and never wished for the Final Fantasy series to ever be centered on sequels or spin-offs. Sakaguchi leaving is what led to all of the FF7 expanded universe content that populated the 2000s, and since this content's creation lacked the presence of the world's creators, it lacked the same quality of storytelling present in that 1997 original. Rebirth is the byproduct of a series spin-off, thus oversaturated with lackluster content. In short, Rebirth is the sequel problem made manifest, and the issues of this archetype of story structure infect every part of it, including the open world. With the exit of Sakaguchi and the emergence of new Square Enix, the Final Fantasy franchise would change forever, as sequels would finally be a thing in its main cash cow series. Final Fantasy X-2 is the first of these direct narrative sequels.
We'll start our own Spec Ops unit! The Yuffie Recon Patrol! Shinra will be afraid to even speak our name. They'll stand in awe of the fair ninja who leads her loyal minions, and tremble in fear when they see the wire peas coming in hot!
Please shut up.
And it would be followed by Final Fantasy IV The After Years, Revenant Wings, Final Fantasy VII's Dirge of Cerberus and Crisis Core, and the Final Fantasy XIII trilogy. Of these, FF13 is the only one that was initially conceived as a series, as FF15 would famously start its development as a part of the Fabula Nova Crystallis set of games. All of these games, including FF13-2, suffer from the sequel problem. The sequel problem is when a narrative sequel for a game, not initially planned with sequels in mind, has to one-up or otherwise continue a story where every arc is finished and the only way to continue it is through extreme contrivance. Of these, Final Fantasy X-2 does the best job of following its original game, as it focuses on the character of Yuna and the world of Spira over one-upmanship. Final Fantasy XIII-2 demonstrates the cardinal sin of narrative sequels as it retcons the ending of the first game and leads the story in a wild, different direction involving gods and time travel, to the detriment of the themes of the first game. Rebirth's status as a sequel to Remake, which is itself a narrative sequel to the original via fate-changing nonsense, follows the Final Fantasy XIII-2 approach to narrative continuation over the X-2 approach. Remake already did this itself by introducing the Whispers and changing fate, and Rebirth does this to Remake by introducing the concept of multiverse madness. The convolution of the plot is to the detriment of the story, and this is the core reason I dislike most of what Rebirth has to offer. Some franchises can get away with poor stories because the series itself is more centered on gameplay than story, like Diablo for example. Other franchises like Final Fantasy require a good story, with great themes and clever writing, because it is an expectation of the series. And Rebirth fails completely in this fashion. And this isn't too surprising, especially when the main creative force behind the original FF7 and its remake series are juxtaposed. The original Final Fantasy VII had Sakaguchi and Kitase, and Remake and Rebirth have Nomura and Nojima, which is a steep downgrade considering the changes they have made to the original story and themes and the quality of their catalog of creative works. I do not like Nomura's brand of storytelling. Everything he touches gets Kingdom Hearts'd, and this is no good when we're talking about an established property. One of the first major projects Nomura worked on is the original Final Fantasy VII, but I don't think he ever really understood the point of that game. After all, he would start the Kingdom Hearts franchise and would be tied to that throughout its entire existence, and is the main reason the story is so nonsensically bad. Nojima, the other main name tied to the writing of Rebirth, was the main creative force behind Final Fantasy VIII. Putting these two together was a terrible idea and is the reason Remake and Rebirth stories are these over-convoluted, bloated messes. The issues start in Remake with the overuse of Sephiroth, introduction of Fate, and implementation of Whispers. They continue in Rebirth with the continuation of all of these and the addition of an unnecessary multiverse plotline. It is my theory that Nojima is responsible for the time rewriting in the first game, and this multiverse plot point is the brain rot abomination of Nomura. This is not to say that these two get everything wrong in Rebirth. I spent a significant part of the beginning of this video covering several parts of the story I think they do quite well, but the parts they do poorly pollute the entire experience, and their writing issues comes from a misunderstanding of the thematic forces of the original Final Fantasy VII, and their goal to shock and awe the audience with their changes. Part of the reason the PSX era of Final Fantasy, the PS1 and PS2 eras, are so good is because of the way they designed their stories around a core theme and extremely deep knowledge of both philosophy and cultural history. This is why the religion of Yevon and the world of Spira in Final Fantasy X is so unique, and why Final Fantasy Tactics is possibly the best written story in the series. The original Final Fantasy VII is thematically enthralling, and that's the core reason I love it so much. This is what makes Barrett's story, tragic as it is, so fantastic. He was willing to sacrifice the planet for the monetary benefit of his community and his future family, and his trust of Shinra is punished with the death of his wife and his best friend. Aerith's connection to the planet feels more personal too, since it seems like her influence over the livestream is what causes Meteor to be stopped. Sephiroth's whole plan is to summon Meteor so that the planet will have no choice but to summon the full force of the livestream to save itself so that he can absorb the livestream to become godlike and to resurrect Jenova. Sephiroth in this way represents the selfish desires of individuals to kill the planet to benefit themselves, and Shinra also represents the corporate monopolists' propensity to kill the planet for profits. FF7's theme and story critique the way the real world works and the nature of humanity. There is loss, perversion of self, and this primary theme of environmental protection. Rebirth casts the brilliance of this down in favor of a basic fight against fate theme, which is better done in Final Fantasy XIII. On top of this, Nomura and Nojima absolutely massacred my boy Nanaki.
Hey, guys! It's me! I'm back! Nanaki? I can't believe it. It really is you.
Tough guy was a front.
We were so worried. Welcome home.
Whoa,
But why?
what in the hell was
Seems like an unnecessary thing, to be honest with you.
guys? It's me.
Never mind, it might be worth it.
Is it true you're a little boy instead of a cool man?
It's my favorite character. I love
We're
this
really
guy.
gonna miss you, Red.
Oh, don't say that. You're only making this harder.
I like you a little less now, Red.
I suppose it was your duty to act the old man.
I wanted you to treat me as an equal, not a dog.
Red 13 has always been my favorite character in the original game, but he fell behind Barrett in this game because of the awful way his character changes the instant the player gets to Cosmo Canyon. Red has an awesome voice and great nonverbal characteristics up until this point, but the instant the party gets to Cosmo Canyon, he completely changes. Yes, I get he's an adolescent for his species. Yes, I get he was making up a voice to make himself sound older. Yes, I get he drops this persona when he's finally among his family. I do not care, because the first and third ones happen in the original too, yet Red's characterization doesn't completely change upon returning home. He's as serious as ever once the party leaves Cosmo Canyon, and the same can't be said of Nanaki in Rebirth. This change is unnecessary and makes me like Red less because he's just a worse character when the player gets to Cosmo Canyon. His dungeon and the end with Guy Natok is similarly awful. Cosmo Canyon and the Seto gut-wrenching plot twist is literally my favorite part of the original, and it is absolutely butchered in Rebirth because Nomura and Nojima are more interested in the Gi and their goal of obtaining the black materia. Like, if you played this section, did you notice how Red 13 is more unsure of himself after this moment in the story? Why is he randomly unsure of himself now? He was so confident before, so now that he has revealed himself to the party, he now needs to ask, hey, is it okay if I do this? Hey, I'm not sure if I'm good fighting anymore. Why did this happen? Like, this is unnecessary. In 10 years, when this Final Fantasy VII Remake saga is said and done, I don't think we're going to reflect positively on these games. I think it's going to have the reverse effect as Final Fantasy XIII, where people really hated that game at first, but now the FF community discourse on it has softened up a lot over the course of the past few years. I mean, this year alone I've seen at least 3 videos talking about how FF13 isn't really bad, and that its major problem is that it just gives off a bad first impression. In the remake series case, people like these games right now, but I wouldn't be shocked to see a slew of Final Fantasy VII Remake Trilogy's story is actually pretty bad videos down the line. And that ending is what really makes me feel this way. When playing Remake back in 2021, I was willing to forgive the whispers and look past the bad changes, but then I got to the final boss and it completely ruined the whole game for me. I went into Rebirth with insanely low expectations, and the ending of this game still somehow managed to disappoint me. I understand what's going on in the ending, and I don't think it's that interesting. The concept of there being multiple versions of Aerith and that these multiverses are stacking on top of one another and bleeding into one another is absolutely terrible. Because of this ending, I'd actually be okay if the third part of this project never comes out, because I don't think I can stand to see where they would take the weapon and meteor arcs of the story. Aerith's death is the most well-known part of the original FF7 story, and for good reason. It functions as the greatest crescendo in the story, capping off the first disc and setting the player up to be excited for what the rest of the game was going to offer. I think Rebirth's ending is trying to do the same, but it doesn't stick the landing at all. I get the writers were in a place where one of the biggest twists of the story is fairly common knowledge among gamers, but in their quest to do something different and to surprise the player, there, they ruined an otherwise poignant moment. When RE2 Remake was remade in 2019, Capcom didn't try to change the ultimate outcome of the game because they knew they already had a masterpiece on their hands. Why did Nojima and Nomura feel the need to ruin the masterpiece they held in their hand? Sakaguchi and Katase designed a story that could still work in the modern day because it is truly relatable and timeless. Aerith's white whispers against Sephiroth's black whispers reminds me of the conflict between Lightning and Caius in FF13-2 and Lightning Returns. And in this juxtaposition, Lightning's story trumps Aerith's for the simple fact that it was originally written that way. It was planned for that to be a conflux of fates competing with one another. The original Final Fantasy VII was not designed with that in mind. Cloud being able to either see two separate timelines in tandem or Aerith's livestream ghost allows Nomura and Nojima to tease at the original timeline of Final Fantasy VII while also changing whatever they like, and that's what they really want with Rebirth. No creative wants to be forced to rewrite someone else's story, so it isn't a surprise to me that they would exert their style of writing over the original, corrupting the whole package. The other characters in the ending show the sorrow they all feel at Aerith's passing, but there's nothing for the player to feel sad about here. Aerith isn't really just dead. She's just physically dead in that specific timeline, that specific universe. But Cloud doesn't act as if she's dead at all because from his frame of reference, she's just fine. Now, there is a chance that this is just alluding to the insanity of Cloud's identity crisis coming up soon in the story, but I bet Nomura and Nojima are going to tie the two together, and I wouldn't put it past them to mess up the awesome scene of Tifa saving Cloud from within his head by throwing Aerith into the mix. These two creatives just can't help but bring their brand of storytelling into FF7, and it just doesn't work for this story. Not in a way that preserves, updates, and honors the original anyway. You see, the main issue with Remake and Rebirth both is the fact that they aren't a true remake of Final Fantasy VII. They are the offspring of Final Fantasy VIII and Final Fantasy XIII, and this is part of why the story is such a mess. Nojima's first major writing role on a big project was Final Fantasy VIII, and the story of that game is well known for its convoluted time compression plot points. However, that game also has its own themes that work for it, and the reason the convolution doesn't kill this game is because it was written with that convolution in mind from the beginning. Final Fantasy VII wasn't written that way, so when Nojima inserts time travel-esque rewriting, it doesn't work in FF7 the same way it does in FF8. In addition to this, the remake series team is made up primarily of developers from the Final Fantasy XIII trilogy, and Final Fantasy XIII's DNA is all over Remake and Rebirth. Their gameplay is a direct continuation of Final Fantasy XIII's paradigm systems. Final Fantasy XIII is the first game to have a stagger meter, and I don't see a lot of people mention that too often. It's common to hate on FF13, but there are good things that came out of it, like the stagger meter and its own focus on a theme, the theme of fighting against fate. Remake and Rebirth not only function as expansions of FF13's gameplay, but Nojima and Nomura also take its theme and run with it over the original's theme. In this way, Remake and Rebirth feel much more like remakes of Final Fantasy VIII and XIII with a 7 coat of paint. The DNA of FF13 shows up in other subtle ways too, like the repetitive appearances of a Roche character. Yogg Roche hounds the party in Final Fantasy XIII, and this is just like Roche in Remake and Rebirth. It is possible that these two characters sharing a name is just a coincidence, but they are pretty similar in how they function in the story. It's stuff like this that makes Remake feel more like 13.4 and Rebirth like 13.5 than 7.2 and 7.3. And just how the writing dropped in quality with each successive 13 game, the writing just keeps getting worse the longer the Remake series of games goes on. Original 7 is great. Remake is pretty bad narratively to an unforgivable degree in the last hour or so, and Rebirth is mostly bad with a few high points sprinkled in. I shudder to think what the writers are going to do to ruin the sections of the story covered in Disc 2 and 3 of the original. I even really like 8 and 13, it's just that the types of stories those games are trying to tell and the themes they are centered around are incompatible with the plotline of 7. Beyond my qualms with the story, the fact that the blood of Final Fantasy 8 and 13 runs through the remake series isn't all bad, as it has led to the creation of Queen's Blood. Queen's Blood is possibly my favorite inclusion in Rebirth. Being the third card game in the franchise, Queen's Blood does a decent job at following up Triple Triad and Tetramaster, although I think Triple Triad still holds the seat as best minigame in the franchise. I used to play Magic the Gathering all the time in college, and I do love board games. It's one of my favorite hobbies. Learning card games is just fun, and Queen's Blood provided me with something new to experiment with, and the game is designed with some pretty fun archetypes to use. I really loved the enhancing, aristocrats, and replacement archetypes, and experimenting with each of these things. There's loads of viable strategies, and this is mainly because of just how easy the opponents are. I would have preferred if the enemy player AI were a bit better, but The Witcher 3 had this same issue with Gwent. Some of the Queen's Blood challenges are pretty rough and absolutely unfair, like the Shadow Blood Queen, and I don't actually like these types of puzzles in card games since they are usually only possible to complete with a hyper-specific build, which takes away all of the experimentation and player expression I love about card games. I would have preferred the different rule sets for different regions thing from the Queen of Cards side quest in Final Fantasy VIII. That would have made the quest to collect all of the cards far more interesting in my opinion. I also love the way the Queen's Blood quest line feels very Yu-Gi-Oh-esque, as the Shadow Blood Queen essentially shadow realms her victims. And I find this to be a fun and clever reference to a beloved anime the target audience of this game would be incredibly familiar with.
It's time to do.
And while completing this side quest and collecting all of the cards is incredibly fun, the same can't be said about the rest of this game's completion criteria. I did not finish the completion process, and I wasn't exactly close. The folios and possibility of needing to play through all of the quests again, like I did in Final Fantasy XVI, made me stop immediately. I platinumed FF16 last year, and it was a miserable experience, because needing to replay the game to completion twice in a row is just not fun. And I don't understand why this has been the consistent completion criteria for Final Fantasy games, starting with Remake. Telling the player to recomplete everything they completed the first time around is not good design, and it's such a big waste of time to do so. In addition to this, I started my hard mode playthrough, but I was instantly bored with the combat and encounter design of the game in Chapter 1. Knowing that hard mode is required for unlocking the Chadley challenges I would like to complete left a bad taste in my mouth, and I uninstalled the game. And it truly is a shame these combat challenges are locked behind that requirement, because I loved all of the ones I completed, especially the ones where 2 hunt tier monsters are put together for the party to fight. The ones involving King Zoo are a proper challenge too, and I would have loved to see what the developers concocted for the other challenges I didn't unlock. Like I said before, I was really looking forward to doing a Summons Boss Gauntlet or something of that nature. These types of things being locked behind a hard mode playthrough might have been fine if the main campaign of this game was interesting enough to do again. Just to test the waters, I played a section of Chapter 3, and when I dove into the Mithril Mines, I just stopped playing. The instant reminder of just how boring the dungeons in this game are was enough to make me not want to touch the campaign again, and it is such a shame because I would love to fight the bosses again with the no item and MP conservation restrictions. Square really needs to think about their approach to hard modes in games, because if they're going to lock completion challenges behind them, then their combat encounter design and story pacing needs to be more in line with the most pure character action games like Devil May Cry, Ninja Ninja Gaiden, or Bayonetta. With the way Remake 16 and Rebirth are designed, this looping through the campaign on different difficulties just doesn't mesh well. I did this for Final Fantasy 16, and even though that's by far the least miserable of this feature of modern Final Fantasy completion, it was still super miserable and hurt my overall experience with the title. The completion process of a game should be fun, and the instant that becomes more tedious and boring than interesting is the moment the game's completion design is inherently flawed. This is just the late game of the completion process, and before it, I had to do things that weren't that great either. Most of the mini-games in Rebirth are pretty dreadful, and the only ones I like are Queen's Blood and Chocobo Racing. I wish I had known about the folio thing before completing the final Shinra Manager questline. That way I could have been saved from the suffering of 3D brawler Sephiroth, as Punch-Out is a terrible game on its own, and it is even worse as a minigame for Rebirth. I spent 50 minutes on this one thing alone, and it was not worth the time considering the fact that I never even got to the sections of the game where the materia from this quest might have been useful. If there's one thing I'm happy I did the completion process for, it's Chocobo Racing. I'm not usually a big fan of racing games or racing minigames, but Chocobo Racing changed that. I had such a blast doing all of the races, and I managed to get a perfect run of the final challenge on my first attempt. I ended up picking up all of the old Gran Turismo games as a result of how much I love that. So if you would all like me to cover those in the future, just let me know. It'll take me a long time to get through all of them, but a like, subscribe, and comment will tell me if that's something you would all like to see. I ended up experimenting with different Chocobo setups for many of the races, and I thoroughly enjoyed figuring out the best ways to win every race. I found the obstacles in the tracks to be mostly fun, other than those Cactuar walls. I never really got the hang of the timing of these, so I started using the Chocobo jump ability in the races that have a ton of these to circumvent the problem entirely. So in terms of the completion process, I recommend you do Queen's Blood, the Chocobo races, and as many of the combat challenges in the game that you can before getting bored. Other than that, the completion process of this game is incredibly weak and not worth the time at all. During the review and discussion cycle for this game, games media almost exclusively talked about how good the game is, explaining why the game is deserving of a 10 out of 10 or 9 out of 10 score. And this is just not a good representation of the game in my mind. Rebirth as a game is not terrible all the time, but it is full of lackluster elements that make it far from being the masterpiece I hear everyone calling it all the time. The game feels fairly average most of the time, and the only thing that really stands out is the combat and boss design, which are both simply excellent. That alone does make the game worth playing. However, the points I always hear people talking about to explain why the game is great is usually centered on its open world and story, which are absolutely the weakest elements of the game. Remake and Rebirth are the 1-2 punch that absolutely deconstruct and outright ruin the original FF7 story, and because of this glaring major issue, I find Final Fantasy VII Rebirth to be severely overrated. If I had to base my opinion of this game in terms of the out of 10 scales a lot of publications use, I would give this game a 7 out of 10 as a complete package, as I find the game to be an average experience most of the time. I don't really rate games in that way though, as I have my own way of explaining whether a game is worth the time investment and money expenditure. Final Fantasy VII Rebirth will not be making my top 100 of the 2020s, even though I don't even have the baseline of 100 games from this decade yet. I just didn't enjoy most of my time with this game, and it is a shame because the original is one of my favorite games from the 90s and is also in my top 100 games of all time. This remake series just has done a terrible job of properly updating the original, and most of the time the story of these games is just a shadow of its original version. I hope that if the rumored Final Fantasy IX remake actually does come out, that it stays much more faithful to its original, as I couldn't stand to see that game butchered in the same way. So to bring this review to a close, and to provide the answer I promised in the intro of this video, I don't think this game is worth playing if you found Remake middling, and or you're a die-hard fan of the original because you find the story and themes to be extremely compelling. It is in the themes and story that Rebirth drastically fails to live up to the standard of its forebear, and it is also where the main brunt of my disappointments lie. And that's the video, my guys. How do you feel about Final Fantasy VII Rebirth? Does your opinion differ from mine? Let me know about it in the comment section below, and while you're there, please like, share, and subscribe. Ringing the notification bell is the only way to be sure you don't miss out on future Rayl Deal Gaming videos. I've got an FF9 challenge run video I'm working on right now that you may like if you're a fan of the Final Fantasy franchise. If you have a moment right now, you may even like one of my other videos on the screen. Regardless of what you choose to do, have an awesome day, gamers.